At 4:30 in the morning, while most of Paris slept, Marie Antoinette finished writing a letter she knew no one would ever read. Her hands were steady, her words were measured. She apologised to her sister-in-law for the pain she might have caused. She expressed her love for her children. She made peace with God. And then she folded the paper carefully, set it aside, and waited for the executioner to arrive. The letter was confiscated within hours. Revolutionary officials filed it away, and it disappeared for years. But here's the thing that makes Marie Antoinette's final days so remarkable. This wasn't a woman who had been broken by months of imprisonment. This was a woman who had been systematically destroyed, her husband executed, her children torn from her arms, her closest friend's severed head paraded outside her window. And somehow, in those final hours, she wrote one of the most dignified documents to survive the French Revolution. When most people think of Marie Antoinette, they think of "let them eat cake," a quote she never actually said. They think of extravagance, frivolity, a foreign queen who didn't understand or care about French suffering. What they don't think about is what actually happened to her. Because the story of Marie Antoinette's trial isn't really about justice. It's about what happens when a government needs a scapegoat so badly that they're willing to do anything, including accuse a mother of sexually abusing her own 8-year-old son to get one. The trial lasted 2 days. The verdict was decided before it even began. And the charges included accusations so monstrous that even hardened revolutionaries were disgusted. On October 14, 1793, Marie Antoinette, former Queen of France, widow of the executed King Louis XVI, mother of 2 surviving children, was dragged before the Revolutionary Tribunal to face charges of high treason, conspiracy with foreign powers, and depleting the state treasury. She was 37 years old. She had spent the last 14 months in prison, the last 10 weeks in a cell so damp that her hair had turned white. She had watched her husband march to his execution 9 months earlier, and she had been separated from her children for 3 months, allowed to hear her son sobbing through the prison walls but never permitted to see him. The courtroom that day was packed. People had lined up for hours to watch the Austrian she-wolf finally get what they believed she deserved. But when Marie Antoinette walked in, pale, thin, dressed in widow's black, many of them were shocked by what they saw. This wasn't the glittering queen of legend. This was a broken woman. And what happened over the next 36 hours would become one of the most infamous trials in European history. To understand why Marie Antoinette ended up in that courtroom, you have to understand who she was long before the revolution began. She was born Maria Antonia in Vienna on November 2nd, 1755, the 15th child of Empress Maria Theresa of Austria and Holy Roman Emperor Francis I. From the moment she took her first breath in the Hofburg Palace, her life was not her own. She was a political asset, a bargaining chip to be traded between empires. And trade her they did. In 1756, less than a year after Marie Antoinette was born, Austria and France signed a treaty that ended centuries of hostility between the two nations. The agreement was directed against a common enemy, Prussia. And to seal the deal, someone would need to marry someone. That someone eventually was the baby Archduchess in Vienna and the teenage Dauphin in Versailles. Marie Antoinette was married by proxy to Louis at 14 years old. She'd never met him. She barely spoke French, and she was shipped off to a foreign court where everything, the food, the customs, the intricate rituals of daily life, was designed to remind her that she was not French. She was the Austrian, the outsider, the interloper. And for the next 2 decades, France would never let her forget it. The marriage was a disaster from the beginning, and not because the 2 teenagers didn't like each other. The problem was more fundamental than that. Louis couldn't consummate the marriage. For 7 years. 7 years of gossip, 7 years of speculation, 7 years of pamphlets and whispers and political manoeuvring, the marriage remained unconsummated. Marie Antoinette's brother Joseph II eventually had to travel to Versailles and have an exceedingly awkward conversation with both of them about the mechanics of sexual intercourse. Whatever he said worked. The couple finally produced children. But by then, the damage was done. Underground pamphlets called Libelle had already spent years attacking Marie Antoinette's reputation, with pornographic cartoons and wild accusations. They accused her of sleeping with every man at court. They accused her of lesbian relationships. They accused her of crimes so vile that even reading about them today is uncomfortable. These pamphlets weren't just crude jokes. They were weapons. They systematically dehumanized the Queen, in ways that would later make it psychologically easier for the French people to accept her execution. By the time the revolution erupted in 1789, millions of French citizens had already been primed to believe that Marie Antoinette was a monster. But the moment that truly sealed Marie Antoinette's fate came on the night of June 20th, 1791. 2 years before her trial would begin, the royal family tried to escape. Here's what you have to understand. By 1791, the revolution was well underway. The king and queen were essentially prisoners in their own palace, guarded constantly, their movements restricted, their power evaporating by the day. Louis XVI had been forced to accept a constitutional monarchy that stripped him of most of his authority, and Marie Antoinette was convinced, correctly as it turned out, that things were only going to get worse, so they planned an escape. The king disguised himself as a valet. The queen posed as a governess. They loaded the children into heavy coaches and set off toward the eastern border, aiming for the town of Montmédy near Belgium, where royalist troops were concentrated. They made it about 150 miles before everything fell apart. The escape failed because of a face on a coin. In the small town of Saint-Menehould, the royal carriage stopped at a posting house. The disguised king stepped out, and a local official named Jean-Baptiste Drouet, a man who would otherwise be a historical footnote, looked at the valet and recognised him. He'd seen that face before, every day in fact, on French currency. Drouet didn't confront them. He let the carriage continue, and then he rode ahead, spread the alarm, and had the family intercepted in the town of Varennes-en-Argonne. Within hours, the King and Queen of France were surrounded by armed citizens and forced to begin the humiliating journey back to Paris. The flight to Varennes, as it became known, changed everything. Before that night, many French people still believed the king supported the revolution, that he was working with the new constitutional government, however reluctantly. After that night, everyone knew the truth. The king had tried to abandon France, the queen had orchestrated his escape, and the moderate path forward that some revolutionaries had hoped for was now effectively dead. Marie Antoinette was branded a traitor, an Austrian spy, an enemy of the French people, and from that moment on, the radicals who wanted her dead had all the ammunition they needed. 40 months later, everything accelerated. On August 10th, 1792, a mob of approximately 40,000 people stormed the Tuileries Palace, the royal family's residence in Paris. The Swiss guards defending the palace were overwhelmed after running out of ammunition. Approximately 800 people on the king's side were killed in the fighting. Louis XVI, recognizing that resistance was futile, ordered his guards to stand down and fled with his family to the nearby Legislative Assembly. They thought they'd be protected there. Instead, 3 days later, they were transferred to the Temple, a medieval fortress that would become their prison. The temple consisted of 2 structures, a palace and a tower. The royal family was confined to the tower, a cold, draughty building with narrow windows and thick stone walls. They were allowed reasonable accommodation, multiple rooms, exercise in the gardens, but they lived under constant surveillance. Armed guards watched their every move. Nothing they said or did went unrecorded, and then things got worse. On September 3rd, 1792, while the royal family sat in their tower prison, Paris descended into collective madness. The September massacres had begun. Mobs stormed the city's prisons, convinced that counter-revolutionary prisoners were planning to break out and slaughter patriotic families, while the men were away fighting foreign invaders. Over 4 days, they murdered between 1,100 and 1,400 prisoners, men, women, some of them children, in an orgy of vigilante violence. Among those murdered was Marie Antoinette's closest friend. The Princess de Lamballe had been Marie Antoinette's confidant for years, superintendent of the Queen's household, a constant companion, someone who had chosen to remain loyal, even as the revolution made such loyalty increasingly dangerous. In August, she had been transferred from the Temple to the La Force prison. On September 3rd, the mob came for her. What they did to the Princess de Lamballe was so brutal that contemporary accounts struggle to describe it. She was stripped, beaten, and killed. Her body was mutilated, and then, in an act of sadistic cruelty that defies comprehension, her severed head was placed on a pike and paraded through the streets of Paris. The mob brought that pike to the Temple. They raised it to Marie Antoinette's window. Think about that for a moment. Imagine being forced to look at your closest friend's face, dead, mutilated, displayed like a trophy, while guards watch your reaction and write down everything you do. That was September 1792. Marie Antoinette would spend another year in prison before her trial. Another year of degradation, fear, and psychological torture. On January 21st, 1793, Louis XVI was executed by guillotine in what is now the Place de la Concorde. Marie Antoinette was not permitted to see him before his death. She was not permitted to say goodbye. She learned of his execution only when she heard the crowd celebrating in the streets. Now she was no longer a queen, she was a widow. And the revolution's attention turned fully to her. The question of what to do with the queen became a political football over the following months. Some deputies in the National Convention suggested exchanging her for French prisoners of war. Others proposed ransoming her to Austria. Her family might pay handsomely to get her back, and France desperately needed money. These options were debated seriously, but the radicals, led by figures like Jacques Hébert, the editor of the violently populist newspaper Père Duchesne, wanted blood. Hébert had built his entire reputation on attacking Marie Antoinette. He had declared publicly, "I have promised the head of Antoinette. I will go and cut it off myself if there is any delay in giving it to me." By April 1793, the Committee of Public Safety, the revolutionary body that essentially ruled France during the Terror, had made their decision. Marie Antoinette would die. The only question was when and how to make it look legitimate. On July 3rd, 1793, revolutionary commissioners arrived at the temple with an order. The 8-year-old Dauphin, Louis Charles, was to be removed from his mother's custody. Their justification was security. They claimed they needed to prevent any plots to abduct the boy. But the reality was far more sinister. They wanted to break Marie Antoinette, and they wanted to use her son to do it. When she refused to release him, the commissioners dropped all pretense of civility. They told her explicitly, "Give us your son, or we will kill your daughter instead." Marie Antoinette handed over the boy. For days afterward, she could hear him crying through the prison walls. She spent hours at her cell door, straining for any glimpse of him when guards took him to the gardens for exercise. She never saw him alone again. What the revolutionaries did to Louis Charles next would become one of the most controversial aspects of Marie Antoinette's trial. They placed him in the custody of a cobbler named Antoine Simon, who was instructed to deroyalize the child, to beat the aristocrat out of him, to teach him revolutionary songs, to turn him against his own family. Within months, they would convince this traumatized 8-year-old to make accusations against his own mother that would shock even hardened revolutionaries. At 2 a.m. on August 1st, 1793, Marie Antoinette was woken in her cell and ordered to dress immediately. She was being moved to the Conciergerie. If you know anything about revolutionary Paris, you know what that name meant. The Conciergerie was called the waiting room for the guillotine. Prisoners sent there typically had days, sometimes only hours, before their trials and executions. In the previous months, thousands of people had passed through its cells on their way to death. Marie Antoinette was assigned prisoner number 280. Her cell was small, damp, and perpetually cold. A low screen divided the room in half. On one side, the former queen. On the other, 2 police officers who watched her constantly, day and night, never allowing her even basic privacy. When she needed to change clothes, she had to do it behind a screen while guards listened. When she needed to relieve herself, guards were present. They took away her knitting needles. Even that small comfort was considered too dangerous. Her meals consisted of cold soup, brown bread, and water served in metal bowls. The window light was thin and grey, filtering into a courtyard reserved for female prisoners. She would spend 11 weeks here before her trial. In late August, something unexpected happened. A royalist loyalist named Alexandre Gance de Rougeville managed to visit Marie Antoinette's cell. Rougeville had been present when the Tuileries Palace was stormed a year earlier, and he'd somehow convinced the prison administrator, a man named Jean-Baptiste Michonis, to let him visit the Queen's cell. Whether Michonis was genuinely sympathetic to the royalist cause, or was actually a spy for the revolutionary authorities, has never been definitively established. Rougeville pinned 2 carnations to his lapel. One of them contained a hidden note with an escape plan. According to the most plausible account, Marie Antoinette received the note and attempted to respond by pricking a message into paper with a pin. She had no ink. But the guard who had been bribed to assist in the escape had a change of heart and revealed everything to his superiors. The so-called Carnation Plot was exposed, and its failure sealed Marie Antoinette's fate. The revolutionary government now had proof that she was still being treated as a queen worth rescuing, that royalist conspirators were still plotting on her behalf. The trial could wait no longer. October 14th, 1793, 8 a.m. The Revolutionary Tribunal. Marie Antoinette was brought into a courtroom packed with spectators who had waited hours for seats. The crowd expected to see the fearsome Austrian she-wolf of propaganda, the monster who had supposedly drained France's treasury and plotted its destruction. What they saw instead was a pale, sick woman in widow's black. Her hair, which had once been elaborate and fashionable, was now white and short, cropped close to her head. Her face was gaunt. She looked older than her 37 years. The trial was presided over by Judge Herman, with Antoine Quentin Fouquier-Tinville serving as prosecutor. Fouquier-Tinville was one of the most notorious figures of the Terror, a man who would ultimately send thousands to the guillotine before being executed himself in 1795 for abusing his authority. Marie Antoinette had been assigned 2 defense attorneys. The principal one, Claude-François Chauveau-Lagarde, was a respected lawyer who had already defended several high-profile cases during the Terror. But there was a problem. Louis XVI had been given weeks to prepare his defense. Marie Antoinette was given hours. Chauveau-Lagarde urged her to request 3 additional days. She did. The tribunal ignored her request. So Chauveau-Lagarde did what he could. He argued that no formal proof had been presented for any of the charges. He pointed out that rumour and public opinion could not serve as legal evidence. He made sophisticated arguments about the lack of concrete documentation. None of it mattered. The verdict had been decided before the trial began. Marie Antoinette faced 3 main accusations. First, conspiring with foreign powers against the security of France. This charge was based on her known correspondence with Austrian family members and with the Swedish Count Axel von Fersen, who had helped plan the flight to Varennes. The correspondence was real. Marie Antoinette had indeed communicated with her family and with foreign courts during the Revolution. But the substance of these letters was largely political advice aimed at protecting the monarchy, not detailed military intelligence that could be called treason. Second, depleting the state treasury through lavish personal spending. This charge was based on her general association with court extravagance, the diamond necklace scandal, and her known enjoyment of luxury. But here's the historical irony. France's financial crisis was not caused by Marie Antoinette's spending. It was caused by structural problems, expensive wars, and a tax system that exempted the wealthy. The Queen's personal expenses, while substantial, were not the primary issue. Third, high treason against the French state. This was essentially a catch-all charge that covered everything the prosecutors couldn't prove under the other 2 headings. A brief detour here, because the diamond necklace scandal was used as evidence against Marie Antoinette, even though it actually proves she wasn't as extravagant as people believed. In 1784, a con artist named Jeanne de Valois-Saint-Remy hatched an elaborate scheme involving a fantastically expensive necklace, 17 huge diamonds arranged in glittering festoons and elaborate pendants. The necklace had originally been created for Louis XV's mistress, but she died before it could be delivered. Valois-Saint-Remy forged Marie Antoinette's signature and convinced a gullible cardinal that he had the Queen's authorization to purchase the necklace on her behalf. The jewellers released it, the con artist disappeared with it, and when the scandal broke, Marie Antoinette was blamed even though she had nothing to do with it. In fact, when her husband had offered to buy her the necklace legitimately, she had refused it. Her actual words, according to the record, France had greater need for naval ships than for jewels. But none of that mattered. The scandal had already crystallized public perception of her as Madame Deficit, the spendthrift Austrian bleeding France dry. And at her trial, the prosecutors used that perception as evidence of her guilt. We need to talk about what happened next because it was the most infamous moment of the trial, and perhaps of the entire revolution. Approximately 40 witnesses testified over 2 days of proceedings. The trial ran from 8 a.m. until 11 p.m. on the first day, then resumed at 8 a.m. and continued for another 16 hours. The schedule was deliberately exhausting, designed partly to break down the defendant. Most of the testimony was predictable: allegations of political conspiracy, claims about secret correspondence, accusations of financial mismanagement. Marie Antoinette maintained her composure, answering questions carefully and denying what she could deny. And then Jacques Hébert took the stand. Hébert was the radical journalist who had been calling for Marie Antoinette's head for years. He had built his entire career on attacking her, and now he had what he believed was his ultimate weapon. He accused Marie Antoinette of sexually abusing her 8-year-old son. The courtroom erupted. This wasn't the reaction Hébert had expected. Women in the gallery began voicing their disgust openly. Even among revolutionaries who had cheered the execution of the king, there were limits, and accusing a mother of incest with her own child crossed them. The charge was entirely fabricated. It was based on testimony extracted from the traumatized Louis Charles by his revolutionary handlers, men who had spent months psychologically manipulating an 8-year-old, teaching him to hate his family, getting him drunk on wine to loosen his tongue. Whatever the boy had said, and the historical record is murky on exactly what that was, it had been coerced from a child who had been systematically abused since his separation from his mother. Judge Herman, perhaps sensing that the trial was veering off course, tried to move on to the next witness without formally restating the charge. But one of the jurors, described by contemporaries as filled with the enormous aberrations of hate, demanded that the accusation be clearly articulated for the record. Marie Antoinette had maintained her composure throughout hours of questioning. She had answered accusations of treason with dignity. She had defended herself against claims of financial irresponsibility. But this accusation was different. She rose partially from her chair, and in a high, clear voice that carried throughout the courtroom, she said, "I appeal to every mother here." The gallery exploded. Women raised their voices in support. For one moment it appeared that the trial might actually turn in Marie Antoinette's favour, that the prosecutors had overreached so dramatically that even a revolutionary audience couldn't stomach it. The news travelled fast. Maximilien Robespierre, dining at a restaurant beyond the Seine, heard reports of what had happened and flew into a rage. According to contemporary accounts, he broke a plate at his table. He believed that Hébert's lunacy, with the incest accusation, had actually saved the Queen by shocking the public conscience. But Robespierre was wrong to worry. The verdict had been determined long before Marie Antoinette set foot in the courtroom. The incest charge was a miscalculation, a tactical error that briefly embarrassed the prosecutors, but it didn't change the outcome. At 4 a.m. on October 16th, 1793, after hours of deliberation that were essentially a formality, the jury delivered their verdict, guilty on all counts. When asked if she had anything to say in response to the death sentence, Marie Antoinette simply shook her head. She had apparently believed, against all evidence, that the worst they would do was imprison her for life. The finality of the death sentence, delivered immediately after the verdict with no deliberation period, was the last shock she would receive. Marie Antoinette was returned to her cell in the Conciergerie, and in those final hours before dawn, she wrote the letter that would become one of the most studied documents of the French Revolution. October 16th, 4:30 in the morning, she wrote at the top. The letter was addressed to her sister-in-law, Madame Elisabeth, the king's younger sister, who was still imprisoned with Marie Antoinette's daughter, Marie-Thérèse. The letter is remarkable for what it doesn't contain. There's no self-pity, no rage at her accusers, no denial of the accusations. She had already done that at the trial, and there was no point in repeating herself now. Instead, she wrote about her children. She asked for forgiveness for any pain she might have caused. She expressed her faith in God. "I hope my son never forgets his father's last words," she wrote, "which I expressly repeat to him, that he should never try to avenge our death." The letter was confiscated within hours. Revolutionary officials filed it away, and it disappeared. Marie Antoinette never knew whether her message reached its intended recipient. It didn't. Madame Elisabeth was executed by guillotine the following year. She never read those final words. At 7 a.m, Marie Antoinette's maid found her lying on her bed, facing the window dressed in black. She was awake. She hadn't slept. When offered broth, she refused. "Everything's over for me," she said. At 8 a.m, she was forced to change into a plain white dress, white being the colour traditionally worn by widowed queens of France. She had to do this while guards watched, protected only by a thin screen that obscured their direct view, but not their presence. Then the executioner arrived. Henri Sanson entered the cell with his scissors. He cut off her hair, a necessary preparation for the guillotine's blade, with quick, efficient strokes. Marie Antoinette fashioned a small bonnet from fabric to cover her shorn head. Her hands were then tied tightly behind her back with a leash attached. The binding was painful, but she didn't complain. She did, however, have to ask the executioner's permission to briefly unbind her hands so she could relieve herself in a corner of the cell. Think about that. The former Queen of France, preparing for her execution, having to ask her executioner's permission to urinate, in front of guards who had watched her every movement for 11 weeks. At 11 a.m, Marie Antoinette was led to an open cart for the journey through Paris. This was a deliberate humiliation. Her husband, Louis XVI, had been granted a closed carriage for his execution, a small dignity that acknowledged his former status. Marie Antoinette was given no such courtesy. She was placed in a wooden tumbrel, the same kind of cart used for common criminals, and paraded through the streets of Paris for anyone to see. The journey took approximately an hour. Crowds lined the route, shouting insults and obscenities. Some accounts mentioned that a few observers were moved to tears or showed visible discomfort with the spectacle, but they were the exception. Most of Paris had been taught to hate this woman for years. This was their moment of triumph. At one point, the cart jolted sharply and Marie Antoinette nearly fell out. She caught herself, steadied her body, and continued sitting upright. The artist Jacques Louis David, watching from the crowd, made a quick sketch of her as she passed. The drawing shows a gaunt figure in white, her bound hands behind her cropped hair escaping from beneath her cap, her expression impossible to read. It's one of the last images we have of her alive. Marie Antoinette reached the scaffold at approximately 12:15 p.m. The Place de la Révolution, now the Place de la Concorde, was packed with an estimated 30,000 spectators. The guillotine stood at the centre, the same machine that had executed her husband 9 months earlier, the same machine that had killed thousands of people during the Terror. According to the memoirs of the executioner's family, Marie Antoinette mounted the scaffold as majestically as if the steps of the guillotine had been those of the grand staircase at Versailles. Whether this is accurate or family legend is impossible to know. What we do know is that something happened as she was being positioned for execution. She stepped on the executioner's foot. "Pardon me, sir," she's reported to have said, "I did not mean to do it." I need to be honest with you here. We don't actually know if she said that. This famous quote, perhaps the most famous thing Marie Antoinette is credited with saying, cannot be reliably verified. The earliest version of the story actually appears in Rousseau's Confessions, which was written when Marie Antoinette was only 9 years old, and the words were attributed to a generic great princess, not to her specifically. The quote was only connected to Marie Antoinette by the writer Alphonse Karr in 1843, 50 years after her death. It's possible she said it. It would be consistent with her behaviour during the trial and her final hours, but we simply don't know. What we do know is what happened next. At 12:15 p.m. on October 16th, 1793, the blade fell. The executioner grabbed her hair and held up her severed head to the crowd, shouting, "Vive la République! Long live the Republic!" Marie Antoinette was 37 years old. Her body was left on the grass near the guillotine while the gravediggers paused for lunch. 2 weeks later, the revolutionary government billed 6 leaves for her coffin, and 15 leaves for the grave and gravediggers. Her remains were dumped into an unmarked pit in the Madeleine Cemetery, along with approximately 500 other victims of the Terror, including Charlotte Corday, the woman who had assassinated the radical journalist Marat, and Olympe de Gouges, one of the first advocates for women's rights in France. The bodies were covered with quicklime, a caustic chemical that accelerated decomposition and prevented identification. If royalist sympathisers ever wanted to recover her remains, they would find nothing recognisable. For over 2 decades, Marie Antoinette lay in that anonymous grave. Then, in 1815, everything changed. Napoleon had been defeated, the Bourbon monarchy was restored, and King Louis XVIII, the younger brother of Louis XVI, the man who had successfully escaped during the flight to Varennes while his siblings were captured, decided to honour his dead family. On January 18th, 1815, the Madeleine Cemetery was exhumed. The quicklime had done its work, the bodies were largely destroyed, and positive identification was impossible. But fragments of clothing and other materials were recovered, and the remains believed to be those of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were transferred to new coffins. 3 days later, on January 21st, exactly 22 years after Louis XVI's execution, a solemn procession carried the remains to the Basilica of Saint-Denis, the traditional burial site of French kings and queens. Today, if you visit Saint-Denis, you can see the memorial sculptures of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette in the main church. Their actual remains rest below, in the royal necropolis, beneath a black marble slab. The trial of Marie Antoinette wasn't really a trial. The verdict was decided before she entered the courtroom. The charges were partially fabricated, and the most damning accusation, the incest claim, was based on testimony coerced from a traumatized child. But what makes her story resonate isn't the injustice, it's the dignity. In those final hours, stripped of everything that had once defined her, her crown, her husband, her children, even her hair, Marie Antoinette found something that the revolution couldn't take. She wrote a letter of forgiveness. She apologized to the executioner for stepping on his foot. She walked to her death like a queen. Her son Louis Charles died in prison 2 years later, at the age of 10, from tuberculosis and neglect. Her daughter Marie-Thérèse survived the revolution and was eventually exchanged for French prisoners of war, living until 1851, the only member of her immediate family to escape the terror alive. The men who orchestrated Marie Antoinette's trial mostly didn't survive the revolution themselves. Fouquier-Tinville, the prosecutor, was executed in 1795 for abusing his authority. Jacques Hébert, the journalist who pushed the incest accusation, was guillotined in 1794 when his radical faction fell out of favour with Robespierre. Robespierre himself followed them to the scaffold 4 months later. The terror consumed its own.